Here's what I wanted to do, and it's kind of funny because all of us have a passion. I'm sure everyone in here as well has a passion for active learning. So I apologize for the didactic nature of this. If at any point you want to stop me and jump in or ask questions, I'd feel better actually, because then it's a bit more of a conversation. But I think what I'm going to try to do, because we want to get into some discussion about some pros and cons of case-based learning versus problem-based, I think it's important that we kind of set some ground rules for what problem-based learning might look like, and that's why I apologize for the didactic nature of this. So we'll start with a little bit of a background and context, do some introduction about what PBL can be and what it looks like and so forth, and then we'll talk about some considerations. So some of the questions that you asked Oscar at the end there, that's going to touch on, like, what do you have to consider if you're thinking about implementing problem-based learning either on a whole school curriculum level or if it's just within a certain course that you're teaching them. So personal background, as Catherine alluded to, I've got quite a bit of experience in problem-based learning. So I emphasize it was in my graduate studies at the University of Toronto in pharmacy that I got into PBL. As an undergrad student at U of T, we were told we were doing problem-based learning, but to be honest with you, it's case-based learning that we were doing. And so that's one thing you'll realize when you're reading the literature about PBL, a lot of people are calling things PBL, and it's actually more case-based. And that's one of the reasons why we're trying to make a very stark contrast. Here's what case-based learning is, here's what PBL is, so that we're clear on what we're talking about. So our full therapeutics curriculum for my doctorate in pharmacy was done using closed-loop iterative PBL, which is what we'll talk about today. When I came to the region then, so I worked in Toronto for quite some time, but I'm a local, but I'm from Maryhill. So I wanted to get out of the University of Toronto, get back to Waterloo. So I was really happy when the School of Pharmacy was announced here. One of the first things I did before our school was ready to go, the School of Pharmacy, the School of Medicine has a satellite campus on the Health Sciences campus. So I actually became a PBL tutor for the medical school there. And as we'll talk about, McMaster is one of the sites that really, or the schools that is really behind this concept of closed-loop iterative PBL. So I got to see it as a student from U of T, as a tutor with the School of Medicine, so I'm very familiar with their approach. I've been doing that for about 8 years now. And then I designed my own course in pharmacy then, and I'll tell you a bit more about that. And we use closed-loop iterative PBL, and this is about the 8th year now that we've had that going on. And the caveat that I'll use is, as I mentioned, Catherine, there's no universal definition of what constitutes PBL. So when I talk about PBL, I'm going to use it, and pardon this sounds so like this sense of inflated self-worth, I'm going to use the purest form of PBL. McMaster would love that, because I'm talking about their form, right? They go, oh, it's awesome. I always joke with the students because there's arguments about the concept of a meta-analysis probably actually did come from McMaster, and so they're very proud of that, right? And the meta-analysis is the highest form of evidence, and it's McMaster saying that, of course, they developed it, right? But I have to agree with them, to be honest with you. This is probably the purest form of it, so I'm going to talk about that. I'll explain what this diagram is, but this, in essence, is closed-loop iterative PBL, okay? So I'm going to come back to that, but that's what I want everyone to know. When I'm talking about PBL, I'm talking about this form in particular, and we'll talk about what each element of that is. A little bit of background about the School of Pharmacy, because I think it's really important, again, when you're considering implementing PBL, it's important to think about your curricular aspects, right, and what your learning outcomes are overall are for your graduates. School of Pharmacy is now a 2+4 degree, so 2 years pre-professional, and then 4 years of the professional education leading to confer the entry to practice Doctor of Pharmacy degree. Virtually all, like I would say the majority anyway, of our students when they come into pharmacy actually have a full undergraduate degree. So it's really important to understand that from where they are in terms of their maturity when they get there. Don't ever tell a pharmacy student they use the word maturity and a pharmacy student together. That's just between us, all right? But they are relatively mature. Our ideal graduate, this is my word only, and I should say I don't speak for the School of Pharmacy, but here's in my mind, like as an instructor at the school, my ideal graduate for pharmacy school is a caring, confident problem solver with excellent communication skills. That's essentially what I want a pharmacist to be who graduates from our school. So the backbone of our curriculum, and again, Lisa's here, so I have to be very careful I say this. I was going to say the most important set of courses that a pharmacy student would take. That's not entirely true. Let me say the most important professional courses that a pharmacy student would take is the therapeutics curriculum. That's where we really teach pharmacists, the pharmacy students about how to critically problem solve, clinical reasoning skills, all of the core bread and butter topics you think a pharmacy student would get: pharmacology, pharmacokinetics, therapeutics, like how do you pick a particular drug for a particular individual? How would you monitor that individual? What is the evidence to support this approach versus that? This is kind of the bread and butter. There are 9 of these IPFC, or Integrated Patient Focused Care modules, that go from the 2nd to the 4th year of the curriculum. Okay? And essentially they're taught in a modular format. So for example, there's some foundational material that's covered in the first module, like clinical biochemistry and therapeutic thought processes and things like that. But then it goes down. IPFC 2 will be infectious disease. IPFC 3 is going to be endocrinology and women's health. IPFC 4, cardiology, and so forth. Okay, so it's centered around a body systems approach. The way that we'll typically teach in this way, and I will say that I designed this whole IPFC 9 series with the end goal of having PBL. So again, we're a brand new school. I knew that I wanted to have PBL at the end of it. Okay, so this is how I designed the first ones that came in. First of all, students are given a main case at the beginning of the week, and this is the example of asthma. So we would have a large case about asthma. Since that's IPFC 1 that they're getting this, it's very general. We'll make it as simplistic as possible because the students are just learning. This is their 2nd year of the program. They're just learning what it is to be a pharmacist. We make a very simple case about asthma, and it'll be a very prototypical textbook case. Students are given that case, and then they start to get a series of lectures. So as you can see, we have pathophysiology. So the first hour of lecture then would be based on this. We talk about pathophysiology of asthma, what causes asthma, what are some of the triggers, what are risk factors, so on and so forth, what do the inflammatory changes lead to. Then they'll go into pharmacology. So they'll learn about the drugs that are used to treat asthma. There are some drugs that are used to dilate the lungs, right? So you can get the air in better. There are other drugs that are anti-inflammatory, which will suppress the inflammation, which is long-term. You have to use the two together. Then there's some add-on drugs. We'll talk about things like that in pharmacology. Medicinal chemistry, so we'll talk about how different modifications to the actual chemical will allow for further lung deposition. Right, so maybe we can get in there, and there's better interaction with at the receptor level. Pharmacokinetics, again, the particle size has to be a certain level, so on and so forth. So get the kind of the science behind what it is to be the clinician. Most of the hours then, these two blue ones, are the traditional therapeutics aspects of that. So then that's when you get a clinician to come in and talk about, okay, how do I approach asthma? Well, first step is make sure the diagnosis is made correctly. Second step, let's stage the person. Where are they in their disease spectrum? Third stage, let's look at some of the evidence or guidelines that are there and so forth. Okay, so essentially we do have didactic lectures, and they're all centered on that main case. Essentially what happens at the end of this set of therapeutic lectures, we almost do a case-based approach. So now we've covered all the material that you should be able to do it, and there'll be a facilitated discussion by the clinician. So I'd stand up here, well, let's bring that patient case up. So first of all, can someone tell me what is the most telling presenting symptom of this individual, and how does that match up with what we know about asthma? And so I do what I like to call more of a, just leave it open. I'm very Socratic when I would do something like this. I wouldn't pick on anybody. As you'll hear about the case-based method, that's not entirely the way it's usually used. But essentially it would be a facilitated discussion where we're applying the knowledge back to that patient in the main case. Essentially what happens after that then, we actually have 4 hours left in the curriculum where we have concepts, what we call mini cases. So that would be maybe something like exercise-induced asthma. Very small subset of asthma. I'm not going to spend any time in class to talk about that, but we would give students, we'd break them into small groups of 6 to 8 students, and we give them a small little case with 3 well-defined learning objectives. Right? So what is the difference between exercise-induced asthma and normal asthma? What are some of the different treatment principles? Design a care plan for the patient you've been given here. And what happens is the students will get a couple hours to study this as a group, and then they would present it to their colleagues. So they get the opportunity to be case presenters and so forth. Okay, so they get some small group, I would call it self-directed learning, but to be honest with you, I'm giving them the learning objectives. They've already had all the lectures. They already know where the textbook is, so it's kind of in between what I would call self-directed learning. And so, as I say, they come back and present many cases. So essentially, that's how most of the IPFC modules would go up until we get to IPFC 9. So that's the last one. And essentially, this is the final therapeutics module students will get before they go out into clinical practice. So we have 32 weeks of supervised clinical practice experiences in the 4th year of our curriculum, and this is in the 8 weeks prior to going out on that. So this is it. They need to know what they're knowing, need to know what they're doing at this point. So essentially what I want at this point, now I'm not so much worried about content acquisition. By IPFC 9, we've covered most of the majority of the therapeutic topics they're going to necessarily need to know. I want them now to start to develop skills. Right? So what things haven't I taught them in the curriculum that they might encounter in practice? I'd rather them be able to develop the skills to go and solve new problems that come up. So that's a really important thing to consider. My main goal as the instructor in this course, skill development. Not as much content. Obviously, I got to test them on some content, but it's much more about the skills to go about doing this. The cases are far more complex. I spoke about early in the curriculum. The asthma case is as straightforward as it can be. But by this time, we make the cases very nebulous. Okay, again, much more reflective of what they'll see in practice. And as I said, the emphasis is going to be on the retrieval, the critical appraisal of evidence, and then the application to patients. This is where we get into PBL, and essentially that's what it is. So, a lot of people give credit to the Harvard Business School for case-based. But to be honest with you, it was the Harvard Law School, right, who did a lot of this first. And it's fascinating. Back then, so this is in the 1870s, the dean of the law school in Harvard said, this is crazy. All the information students do, I'm either up here lecturing or they're looking in, and this is what they say, stuffy old law books. So imagine in 1870 how stuffy an old law, if they're using that terminology then, like these must have been really stuffy and old. He said, so we're not going to do that anymore. So essentially, the dean of the law school at that point said, I'm not going to lecture anymore. Instead, I'm going to take actual cases that have been decided in a court of law and give that to students. And they're going to have 2 hours to read about it and to do some resources or research. Again, I can't imagine, like nowadays we just hop on Medline. I don't even know what they would do. I guess go to the library and fight over the one textbook that's there. I'm not sure. But they would actually study this up, and then the class would reconvene, and this professor would stand up, and it's awesome. So if he was alive nowadays, he would be sitting with a toque and a plaid shirt in a cafe in Seattle. This guy is hipster all over him. He's got a beard out to here. It's awesome. Like he's a really good beard. He would stand up there and he would use the method, two things. One, he was one of the first people to use Socratic methodology. So that's where you would ask questions to guide it, right? So he'd stand up there. The second thing he introduced was cold calling. So he'd stand up here and say, Juan, so what is the most applicable case precedence for this case that we're discussing today? Out of nowhere, right? And you'd be like freaking out, right? Because this guy with the awesome beard is coming up to you and like pointing at you. You have to answer right away. And so that was the model that he used for case-based, okay? So some advantages and disadvantages. So again, there was already an answer to these cases. The idea was he wanted the students to understand the principles. The business school then came along in the 20s and sort of adopted this a little bit, changed it. And they said, we don't really want to do that cold calling. So they used the concept of warm calling, okay? So same thing. The students would get a case. It would be a case without a solution, though, kind of exactly what Oscar was talking about, is the fact he just gives a case. I'm not giving the answer. The students would prep, and they'd come into class, and then they would use a Socratic method, and the prof would be up at the front and I would say, Juan, in about 5 minutes, I'm going to ask you to share your analysis of this case. And then they go on and do something. So it's a little bit less, it's still stressful though, right? In 5 minutes, you have to tell me everything that you want to do. But it was slightly different. So, and that's the Harvard business case method. McMaster then had a unique opportunity, kind of like us at the School of Pharmacy, brand new medical school, right, in the 60s. And they had the opportunity to throw medical education on its head, and that's exactly what they did. The founding 5 fathers they talk about, I can just picture them sitting around in a smoking room and just talking about life. And I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall for this. But essentially all of these founding fathers were physicians. And they said, it's really interesting. We're impressed continually about medical students, about how they can memorize staggering amounts of information and regurgitate it back on an exam, right? And they're brilliant. I know from educating medical students, holy smokes, the amount of stuff they can memorize. But to a T, when they get out there on their first clinical rotation, you're standing at the bedside, and I've been there as an attending pharmacist, and I'll say, okay, so what do you think the most important problem this patient is presenting with? They're like a deer in the headlights. And it's like we just covered that last week. Like, it's heart failure. It's clear, right? The person can't breathe, and they've got fluid on them. Like, it's heart failure. But they couldn't do that. So it was the synthesis and application they really struggled with. The second thing was, and this is one that we have at the School of Pharmacy too, and Lisa will probably know, the students will always say, why didn't you teach me about X in pharmacy school? And so I always get like multiple sclerosis. We don't actually have multiple sclerosis. It's an important condition, and again, I don't wish on anybody, everyone should know how to treat it. We have no room to fit that in though. So instead, there we're struggling with the same issue. How do we deal with the topics that either we can't cover because we don't have space, or, and this is even more important probably, is the information changes. So when I teach them about hypertension, a month later, hypertension is completely different now, right? Because there are new guidelines or new studies out. So that's why they said we got to change the way we look at medical curriculum. And this is where they came up with problem-based learning. So the concept, and one of the most defining features of this method is that the case, okay, the problem is the stimulus for learning. Now you could say, well, that's kind of like case-based method. Well, not entirely. So case-based methodology typically will say give a case, and there will often be some guiding questions. So it's actually the questions that are being asked that is the stimulus for the student to go, oh, I better go answer that question. In this, it's just the problem. There are no set of questions that go along with it. It's just here's a problem, and then that is the stimulus for the student to go out and learn about that particular case to solve it. So the steps that the broadly take, if I distill it down into 4, is the first thing the students are encouraged to do, and we'll show you exactly how this is done, is they need to stop and think about, what do I actually know about this problem already? Right? So it's really powerful to start to acquire, okay, so I know some stuff. I'm not completely dumb. There's something I can apply to this case. So define what you do know, and then they have to start thinking about what do I need to know, though. There are obviously some knowledge deficits, and I don't know about that particular thing. They need to go off and independently, again, another key factor that often defines differences between the PBL and case-based, independently they need to go off, access resources, right? Retrieve information, appraise that information, because nowadays, again, everyone can just Wikipedia stuff, but really, where'd that come from, right? Like, has that been peer reviewed, or have you looked at some of the design methodologies and so forth? Critically appraise and apply that information back to them, and then is the key. It's interesting. I was telling Steve, I've never heard those 10, stages of learning type thing, and the concept of working as a team, because healthcare in particular is delivered in teams, but I know for other disciplines it's the same thing. If you can't work within a team and use your knowledge, you're not going to be as effective as you could be. So why? Right now I'm going to say there's loads of evidence looking at PBL. Like a lot of other educational methodologies, I can't stand up here and say PBL is clearly better than everything. It's not. Right? If you pick the right task for it, I think it's probably better than some, but if you pick the wrong task, it's actually probably worse than some. So this is essentially a summary of the evidence that's available for using PBL in medical education. And there are a lot of links between pharmacy and medicine, and that's why I often go to this. So student engagement, clearly, like when you hear what the process is, it can't get more engaged in this. There is some information that suggests knowledge retention might be better. Okay, so they have actually studied graduates of PBL programs, and they appear to retain knowledge slightly a bit more, certainly greater self-directed skills. And some of the cognitive skills, like coping with uncertainty. So I think we've heard that a few times in here. That's a big thing. In the clinical sciences, it's incredible, right? Like when you're a student in there and you've got the expert at the front and they ask a question about how to deal with hypertensive emergency, I can just ask the prof, and the prof will tell me what to do. But when they're an intern, right, in an emergency department, that patient comes in and there's no one else around, it's like, holy crow. Like I can't just go and ask that professor that. So this is really important for the clinical science. I'm sure for all of your disciplines as well, but this is really what attracted us to it in pharmacy and in medicine. And finally, it bears a striking resemblance to real life. Again, the cases are real defined, just like in practice, right? The patients coming in with a variety of different things that we can't that aren't necessarily clear to us, and so we sort of have to cope with the information that we're given. So the key elements for this then. The literature is pretty clear that ideally the group size is around 6. Okay, so the students should be placed in groups of 6, certainly no more than 8. Once the groups get bigger than 8, it just falls apart, and the literature bears that out as well as experience. They need a problem, and so that's the case, and we'll talk about how to develop those cases. Another thing that's really important is there has to be protected time in the curriculum. So already there were some questions about, wow, how do you cope with the fact that these types of things take a lot of time? Even if you're doing facilitated discussion, it takes a lot of time. If I'm giving the students 4 to 6 hours where they're not in class and they're on their own doing independent things, like you imagine like a lot of instructors like, what, they could be doing anything then, like, they need me to learn. No, that's the key. We have to learn to sort of let them go, like, and give them this problem and let them do it. It's probably better. But you've got to make that time in the curriculum. Without it, as you know, students will say the same thing like, oh, do I really need to read this case? Come on, man, the baseball playoffs are on. I don't really feel like doing it. And I did this last night, so I didn't watch the baseball game like I wanted to, but so it's important to make sure, I'm going to show you how we do that in pharmacy, and then a tutor. And this is crucial. We'll talk about some of the considerations about figuring out what the tutors are. This afternoon, we're actually going to do a problem-based learning case, okay? But for those of you who aren't going to be here this afternoon, I'm just really going to quickly go through the steps that you do. And if you do come this afternoon, that's the teaser here. We're going to do this. Again, number one is identifying the problem. So the case will be given. I'm going to show you what a case looks like. The students have to sit there. And again, you think, oh, it's the case, but no, often the problem is underneath the layers of information that's given, right? Again, these problems are written in a different way than you would typically write a case study where it's, here's the clear thing, design a break, for example, right? This will be a patient kind of shows up and here's what their symptoms are and stuff like that, and they're kind of a little bit upset, and you kind of leave it at that. It's like, well, holy smoke, what's even going on? So the first step is identifying what the problem is. As I mentioned, identifying the prior knowledge, okay? Generating hypotheses and possible mechanisms. So again, especially where I have it placed in our course series, BIPFC and their fourth-year students. So some of my cases have elements of cardiology in it, even though they learned cardiology 2 years ago. So if I have something about a blood pressure measurement in there, hopefully the students are generating hypotheses. You know, I wonder if this blood pressure related. Could it be a hypotensive reaction? That's why the person's confused. That's the type of thing they should be doing at this point, is generate a few hypotheses about what might be happening. And after they've done that then, they identify their learning issues and come up with learning objectives. Once again, a defining feature of PBL versus case-based learning or team-based learning, the student defines their learning objectives. Here's what I think we need to go and learn about to apply it back, okay? And that's a crucial evidence. Number 5, this is where they go out and do the 4 to 6 hours of self-study. Again, the discussions are done in group, but the study is done individually, and they go off on their own for 4 to 6 hours, and then they come back, and that's where they reevaluate it. So they have a group discussion about, Juan, what did you learn? Lisa, what did you get about this one? Oh, here's what I found. Oh, I found there was controversy about here. What did you find in your reading? That's the discussion that happens. And once they've satisfied their learning objectives, that's when they'll apply that information to the case and hopefully come up with a solution. And as you can imagine, every single one of these PBL cases that we have in pharmacy, there's probably at least 5 or 6 very reasonable and rational solutions that the students could take. Yes?
So for the self-study, do you direct them specifically to do that individually? Because it would seem like you got a problem, you kind of parse this out.
You bet.
You do this, you do this, and we'll get together.
So we have discussion, and that's a great point. So the question again was just for the camera. So do we actually, make sure they do it individually, or because it makes sense. The students will probably go, why don't you do learning objective 1 and 2, and I'll do 3, and you do 4, 5, 6. Some of that's going to happen, and so especially the first couple of weeks. So when I do the introduction for students and teach them what PBL is, I talk about that and I say, look, as a student, I know what you mean. Like you got you got 2 midterms this week. The temptation is there to split up the learning objectives. The problem is 2 things. One, the discussion in the tutorial is going to be far, far lower quality if only 1 or 2 people prepared for a given learning objective than if all 6 of you have. So that's one, is the quality of discussion. The second thing is, the idea with PBL is if you prepare for your tutorial group every week and you do all of your learning objectives at once, your studying for the exam is done. You don't technically even have to. I've had a lot of students say that. I didn't even study for that exam. It was awesome because I was ready because I prepared for it. Exactly. So we do encourage, maybe I should say that, I encourage them to do it independently. And I think in most cases, and we have a tutor coming this afternoon from pharmacy, and she can tell you, you can tell some of the groups that maybe do parse it out, and that's the role for the tutor then to pop in and say, look, I just want to let you know, you're being graded on your participation in tutorial here, and I've noticed that you'll talk for 1 or 2 of the objectives, but not for the other 3, so if you want your grade to go up, you need to participate a little bit more consistently. So good point. So we can only encourage them to do it all independently. Here's what it looks like just pictorially, okay? And again, this is closed loop. Another term for this type of PBL is iterative. So either closed loop or iterative PBL. And this was the McMaster model, okay? It was, and I always say Harold instead of Howard. It was Howard Barrows is the one who came up with this here at McMaster. So again, a clinical problem. This is all inside the small group, okay? The students get the problem, they come up with their learning objectives, then they go out and do stuff individually. Then they come back, discuss what they learned, and here is a very key point right here that I haven't even mentioned to this point. And this is one of the other defining characteristics of PBL versus case-based. The opportunity for reflection. And the reflection is in my mind crucial for a couple different reasons. Again, for our profession especially, we're really encouraging healthcare professionals, whether I'm teaching in medicine or in pharmacy, to be reflective practitioners. Right? So after every clinical encounter, ideally you should be saying, okay, what went well there? Right? Do I think I did a good job gathering information? Did I demonstrate an appropriate level of empathy? Did I use the best evidence to solve that? Could I have done a little bit better? So reflective practice is a key factor that we want in our programs. Okay? So it's very important. So what will happen is the tutor will go around the group and say, great, so we're finished with the case, you applied it back. Let's go around now and think about maybe one thing that you were very happy with in terms of your own preparation over the past week. Right? Did you like how much, were you very extensive in your research or were you not? And then maybe one thing that you're going to work on next time. You know, and the students will often say something like, oh, I didn't really critically appraise that paper very well. When I brought up that paper as a source of evidence, 3 people actually told me why it wasn't that good. So I'm going to make sure I give more time to that. And then there's also reflection on group process. So again, you as an individual, how did you participate in there? And are there ways maybe that the team as a whole could improve on their performance for next week? So those the reflection on those 2 particular things are crucial. And again, our defining characteristics in my mind of PBL versus some of the case-based learning then is the actual intentional self and group reflection then.
Sorry, Jeff.
Yeah.
Do you formalize that process by reflection submission? Did I miss that at the beginning?
So what happens is the reflection is led by the tutor at the end. So again, I'll get more specific what happens in tutorials, but the tutor would be here, and the tutor's a fly on the wall, essentially. In a well-functioning PBL group, the tutor's saying nothing. Okay, the students are running this whole show. Tutor's just sitting back there making sure they get the learning objectives the instructor was hoping. I'll show you what that looks like. Maybe if they go off tangent a bit, tutor might pop in and go, oh, okay, let's head back into here. You know, that type of thing. It's at the end, though, the tutor will lead a facilitated discussion. That's about the only thing the tutor really facilitates is, okay, let's do some reflection now. Again, one positive and one constructive feedback for yourself, one positive and constructive feedback for the group. And then you just go around in a circle like that. Okay, and I'll show you how that fits on the rubric to make sure the students are doing that, giving that adequate time. Here's what the actual tutorial would look like then. Okay, and so at U of T, this is what it would look like. You know, when I do it at McMaster, this is exactly what it would look like. This is what it looks like in the School of Pharmacy. So, you know, the bulk of the time here, this is almost 2 hours, is discussing the learning objectives from the prior week's case. Okay, so 2 out of 3 hours, the students are going, okay, learning objective 1. What'd you guys get for the evidence supporting using a blood pressure true machine versus manual sphygmomanometer? So you'll talk about the evidence, that type of stuff, and that discussion was great. Learning objective number 2. So, okay, majority is discussing the learning objectives that the students came up with. Take a bit of a break, and then they come back, and I call it back to the case. That's where they apply the information. So let's have a good discussion. How does that information fit into the characteristics of this? So the students will read the case line by line, and start to apply the information back. Oh, you remember when we didn't know why there was discrepancy between the blood pressure when he measures it at home versus in the clinic? Now we know, based on the evidence we spoke about, here's the reason why. Okay, so that's the back to the case. They'll also come up with a therapeutic plan. And oftentimes there's debate about it, right? One student will come up with a plan. Well, I think we should increase the dose of bisoprolol. Well, I was thinking we should get rid of it. And it's the discussion and then the richness of, well, why would you get rid of it versus why would you increase it and so forth that really helps reinforce the learning that the students have. Next thing then is they develop learning objectives for the new case. I make sure that the cases that the students get in our course, they don't get them in advance. And the reason, as you can imagine, if you got a relatively light week in the curriculum, which most pharmacy students do, we don't have any light weeks, but if you had a lighter week, students might have a temptation to go ahead and say, I'm going to start working on that case and that case. No, the idea is you focus for that 1 week, it's that one case. So I actually have the cases released the morning of the discussion, and the students have no idea what they are then. So then they get the case, and then they go through the learning objective process again, develop their learning objectives for that case, and then the reflection happens at the end of tutorial. Okay? And then they go off again, do 4 to 6 hours of learning, and then they come back and they repeat that process. So that's what the tutorials would look like. Just to sort of start to, and Oscar's going to come up and show some of his thoughts, which I think are fantastic. These are a couple of thoughts that I have where either people have, and I hate the term, but no, I won't even use it because we're in a mixed company, so I'm not going to say this term. I'll say it. Maybe if you buy me a beer at the grad pub later, I'll use this term. But here where some authors and or instructors have sort of modified what I sort of think of as the purest form of PBL and sort of changed it. In some cases, I think they've made it completely not PBL because of this. So I'm not trying to encourage you to do this, but I'm just showing you here some of the things when you read evidence about PBL. Keep this in mind because it might not actually be the type I'm talking about. So the first one is the students encounter the clinical problem. And again, as I say, that's a defining characteristic of PBL in my mind. The problem is the stimulus for learning, okay? Oftentimes what we see at PBL, and they call hybrid PBL, they'll actually give information. So, okay, let's start by a lecture. I'm going to talk to you about hypertension, okay? And I give you an hour lecture on hypertension. Now I'm going to give you a case. That's not PBL. But there are, again, in the literature, there'll be people who will do that. So if you provide information, like either readings or lectures or those types of things, it's, again, in my mind, it's not quite the same. Second one, students assess the problem and define learning objectives. A lot of PBL literature is rife with examples of instructors we always try to do it, and I love to lecture. I try to insert myself because I'm like, how can they possibly learn without me? So here's how I'm going to insert myself in this process. I'm going to give you the learning objectives. Here's the case. Here's the 4 things that you need to know to address it. Well, that's, again, it's so much more stimulating if the student has to do this process of like, what do I know and what don't I know, right? Maybe one of my learning objectives they already know. So that's awful of me, very paternalistic to say, you need to learn about this. Maybe they know enough about that. And once again, we're trying to prepare them for real world. I'm not going to be there to say, here are the learning objectives for that patient that just showed up. I want them to be able to go, what do I know about this patient that just showed up and what do I have to go figure out? So again, I think that's a big, these two are kind of game, I think those shouldn't be called PBL if these things are done. Here's another big thing. They try to cram things because again, we're trying to control the amount and it's like, I got to cover all this content and that type of thing. So they don't really need that 4 to 6 hours. And I know we have written in our syllabi that we expect the students will do about 2 hours of independent work, right, for every hour they're in class. Or I don't even know what the breakdown is, but they should just do this. Well, we know they're not going to do it. And if they do, it'll be very superficial. Again, it's crucial in my mind and in all the PBL curricular literature that's out there that uses this closed loop form, it's clear. You need to block off hours out of the curriculum. You're going to sacrifice content that you provide, but if used appropriately, the students will actually get far greater depth in that particular content area. Sometimes at the expense of the breadth, but they'll certainly get the depth in that model. Yes?
I was curious how you map individual student groups and their learning objectives into course learning outcomes, program learning outcomes. Do you build across?
I'll show you. Can I come back to that? That's a great question. That's coming up. I promise I'll come to that then. So that's one. So that's what I see often. Like, and case-based learning is a good example. You know, sometimes it's like 1 or 2 hours. Or I might here. I'm going to give you a case. I'm going to give you 45 minutes of class time to kind of research it, and then we're going to have a facilitated discussion. Again, that's where it falls down in the PBL method. There's not enough time to research that then. Students come back, and the students lead the discussion in PBL, right? So the tutor's here, but the students are the ones that say, hey, you know, we had learning objectives 1 through 5. I think it makes more sense if we talk about learning objective 3 first. Is that okay? Yeah, for sure. Let's talk about 3. That's all student done. Tutor's sitting there just kind of listening, right? So the students, in this case though, it usually case-based, it's an instructor facilitated discussion, much like what I'm doing here, right? Maybe with Socratic method. Okay, when you read that case, what do you think about what the patient said when they came back here? That's a facilitated discussion using Socratic, as opposed to PBL where it's very organic and the students are the ones that are driving all of this discussion. And the last thing, as I said, reflection. And this may be from my healthcare background, but I really think those reflections are crucial. And a lot of the PBL that's out there doesn't have that reflection piece, right? It's just more about, it's all about, let's get some knowledge and apply it to a case. Again, and there are times when you might just want to do that. Again, I don't mean to be derogatory. I'm just saying, but what defines this closed loop versus that is that opportunity for the reflection. Okay, couple considerations for success. How would you maybe do about some of this? I think I've alluded to most of these already, but the first thing is sequencing. So there are different models out there. So there's actually one school of pharmacy in North America that is all PBL, and it's Dalhousie University. Okay, so you could do it. 2 of their grads are on faculty at U of W, so I've spoken to them a lot. And technically they said, well, some of the fundamental courses are actually taught more didactic, to be honest with you. So it's actually not the whole curriculum, but they like to sort of say it's the whole, but it's not really the whole curriculum. But so McMaster, I thought the McMaster School of Medicine was all PBL. Yeah, not so much. So like clinical skills, like when they learn to say, for example, take a manual blood pressure, right? Or assess for the presence of fluid overload, that's still done in a clinical skills lab, and it's a more traditional way. And I would agree, like that's a good example of that's not a proper learning outcome. If you're into that learning outcome of assessing volume overload, PBL is not the way to go. So again, even programs that are fully PBL, there are going to be some things you're probably not going to want to teach that way. If you're going to insert it into a course within a curriculum, I think it's important to consider, where is this? Are we in early years of it? Or are we in the later? And again, in pharmacy, I made sure we did it for the last one. I gave them some skills to sort of develop to get to there, but it's the last one where I want to prepare them for the uncertainty in that type of thing. So thinking about that will help you maybe decide, is PBL right? And if it is, it isn't. And then where should it maybe be? And I kind of like that because it's tricky, because you will always get the students saying, okay, but what's the right answer? Right? Can we not have that big group to facilitate? Tell me what the answer was for that hypertension case. I said, no, like, and it's the same thing every year. I would much rather have the students still be upset with me and think that I'm you know, gypping them out of their education as students, you know, because I'm not giving them the answer. But it's fascinating how many people come back afterwards and like, oh my God, like, you know, I'm so much more comfortable with uncertainty than my colleagues who are at U of T or wherever, because you allowed us to realize, no, there isn't necessarily the right answer, right? So you're going to take some hits maybe on your vowels, but again, years later then, just keep those emails, right, the feedback emails, and look back at them when you get a bad eval. That's what I do anyway. Sequencing, so make sure the important foundational things. So for pharmacy, a good example of this would be the therapeutic thought process is one thing we teach about pharmacy, and that's taking a patient's medications and making sure, are all of them indicated, are they effective, are they safe, and can is it too expensive, and can patients comply with it? So we teach about therapeutic thought processes prior to this course, because that's important foundational stuff. Okay, and probably the best ways to do it in different active learning techniques. Once they've got that though, the foundational stuff there, then that's kind of where you might think about putting in that. And as I mentioned with medicine, patient assessment is not covered using PBL. And also it's important, so for us, we are really requiring the students to use a high-level critical appraisal. So again, not just retrieving information and reading the abstract, diving into the papers, evaluating the appropriateness of the science and making sure that the paper is internally valid, and then using the generalized, is this generalizable? So it's really important that they have foundational skills in critical appraisal. So we build that throughout our curriculum so that they're ready. And I actually have an evidence-based medicine boot camp that the students do for the first week and a half in my PBL course so that they remember, okay, there's gonna be a lot of critical appraisal here. Okay, so make sure that the appropriate supports are provided as well. Just to show you how we have this, so it's these white boxes, okay? So here is when the tutorials happen for my course. So I actually have a 4-hour block here. Lisa, don't tell the curriculum committee I'm only using 3 hours of that. Okay, they think I'm only using 3. So 3 hours, this is the only time that they have to be in class. These other hours, and in this particular case, it's 5 hours and an extra hour here for this tutorial. We have 6 hours where the students have no class, but they're associated with my course. Okay, so anytime a student says, I didn't have enough time, you've got 6 hours in this course, and then you also, if you need to do some extra time, that's going to be expected. So it's right in there. The students know that I am being firm. You need to read this case and be prepared to discuss it, and I'm giving you plenty of time to do it in this curriculum. So that's kind of what I mean about making sure you've blocked off time in the curriculum for that. Physical space. So we have 120 students in our program, so we need 15 rooms to handle 8 students. Oh yeah, and by the way, we have 4 years of our program, and we've got a grad program, and so everyone's clamoring for space. And so like our curriculum assistant is, I'm not her favorite person in the world. So I was like, hey, we need another room for this. She's, oh my God, like this PBL stuff is killing me. So that's one thing to think about, right? So again, and I've been told a few times, can't you just put one of the groups like in the big lecture halls? So imagine that you're in a cavernous like 180 seat lecture hall and you've got like 6 people sitting in one corner doing a discussion. No, it has to feel right. So what I've done, some of my tutors actually in good weather like this would take their group outside, sit around a picnic table. Some have gone for a walk in the park because again, there's data that says that if you're, it stimulates creativity if you're walking and doing physical activity. So you can do whatever you want that way. But I'm just saying, envision this as this is a group discussion. It should be comfortable and have it at a coffee shop. I cut it off at a pub. Steve's laughing. Yes, I have been asked if it could be at a pub, and I said no. But you can go there after, but you can't go there during. So, but just think about that. That's what you're trying to set up as a comfortable environment. The case, I'm not going to read through all these. All these slides will be available to you, okay? It's the same thing as case-based learning, though. It's got to be realistic. So I pull in patient cases right from my clinic. And obviously de-identify it, but I don't change aspects of the case. It's like, here's what I had to deal with, and so now it's your turn type thing. And so here are some aspects and an excellent reference for looking at aspects of a good case, okay? So I'm not going to talk about that more. What's really important when you're designing the case are, though, and this gets back to that, so how do I map my objectives to like overall curricular objectives? I do have instructor objectives for each case. Okay, so when I'm designing it, obviously I have to think about, well, what are learning outcomes for my course and how am I going to achieve that? Here's how I'm going to achieve that, right? So I have objectives, and as you can see, this should be a gray box, but it's not showing up as gray, but here's what the case would look like that the students get. And again, if you're interested, I can even, anyone who wants, maybe I can share the cases we're using this afternoon as examples. After anyone who can't make it today, after we do today's, I'll share what a case would look like that the student would get. And then the tutors actually get a separate case to make sure that they're obviously a bit more comfortable than the students with this. So here's what the students, or the tutors would get that the students would not. Now, you might go, so you're doing the objectives after all in the background. Well, no, what happens is I'm saying to the tutors, let's make sure that at bare minimum, the students are going to be able to address this by the time they've had that discussion, okay? If the students want to, and oftentimes they will, use this as an opportunity to go back, oh, you know what, something else I want to do. I've always wanted to look back to, is aspirin something we should be using in someone with hypertension? It's not one of my learning objectives, okay? But I would tell the tutors, absolutely, tell the students, go ahead. Yeah, spend 5 minutes. Go back and look at, is aspirin worthwhile? Because again, it's very powerful stimulus for learning is that student interest and piquing their interest in these cases. So that's how I map it back. I've got my objectives. The tutors are there to make sure that when the students come up with theirs, they're similar to this enough that when I ask a test, they're going to be ready for that. But they don't stifle any creativity on the part of the learners. Okay, so that's how I would use it. Yep.
So if they take a swing on a miss, let's say they don't cover sprint studies for some reason.
Yep.
Then the tutor would bring that.
You got it. And they do it in the way of probing questions. So the tutor, which I'll talk about in a second, the tutor will actually, instead of just saying, oh yeah, by the way, yeah, it's Dr. Nagge's got it down there. You got to make sure you read the sprint trial. They're not going to say that. They'll say, anyone aware of any recent studies that have been done in this area? Okay, anything, the sprint trial ring a bell or something? Oh, that's that trial, the 120 versus 140. We should probably look at that. When I have specific things like this, though, I actually, the only references I will actually give the students, I make sure that every single case they have at least one piece of evidence that they must formally critically appraise, and they're going to be required. So I actually put those, so they are listed as references. I've got the sprint trial at the bottom and the HIVIT. So often the tutor will even just go, okay, I don't see any objectives. What about those 2 references that are down there? And they go, oh, okay, he probably wants us to critically appraise the sprint and the HIVIT and that type of thing. So that's exactly it. The tutor will help guide them to make sure that they've got all of these learning objectives. And it's fascinating. I wish if you were here this afternoon, you hear Justine is one of my tutors, and I know this from the medical school. It's unbelievable how good the students are when they take it seriously. They'll come up with these, and oftentimes they'll even come up with them like, holy, so that's awesome. And I'll do it next year. I'm like, oh, I should put that as one of mine because that's a really good objective. So they are excellent with this, okay? And it's not like the tutor has to tell them 3 out of 4. It's like maybe 1 out of 5. That's it. And otherwise, the students get all of them themselves. The other thing that goes into the case, and this is probably the one knock on PBL, a lot of upfront work on the part of the instructor. Now that the course is running smoothly, it's golden. I'm on a golf course half the time when these tutorials are going on. I'm not a tutor, right? I'm not, and it's important because if I'm a tutor, you can imagine the class is either going to say, he's so hard on me, I don't want him as my tutor, or great, I get all the answers, like he's going to be my tutor. So it's not fair. So I'm not a tutor. I get other tutors to do it. The upfront work is incredible to design good cases, to make sure that the tutor guide is updated. So as I mentioned, the area of hypertension is an example. Every year there's about 2 or 3 fundamental studies that change or guideline updates. I got to go back and fix this because my tutors aren't experts in hypertension. So here's the type of what I would have in the tutor guide. So I give them the learning objectives, and then I give them a tutor guide. It's not an answer key, but a lot of people think of it as that. But it's essentially, it's to help the tutor help the students. So if the students get stuck, I put everything in the form of a probing question. So this would be what I always say to the tutors when I'm training them. Use some of the probing questions if the discussion is up down. For example, and I forgot my English office. How would you estimate this patient's risk of a cardiovascular event? Right? That maybe is how the tutor would insert themselves quickly, and that would start the discussion again, and then they sit back. But then this gives the tutors like what I'd like them to cover. And I hope the students are going to talk about this. Go, well, oh, the guy's already had a stroke, so we can't use Framingham. What would we use? Okay? So the tutor guide, the objectives are pretty easy because I know what I want. It's the keeping those answers up to. Now, the disc brake example, I can imagine you'd be out golfing with me because the disc brake for that example probably wouldn't change a whole lot. So you may or may not have to update it a lot. So again, a lot of upfront work with this, but then downstream, it's much easier for the instructor.
Jeff, do you also incorporate, so you have a nice guide for the tutor to incorporate a sort of training session?
You bet. And so I'm going to get to that. I'm not at the tutor yet, but no, that's perfect, Jay. So I'll talk about that then, because that's key. For the case,
add one thing?
Yes.
Just about his tutor guide. So when I saw his actual case, like his case is like, whatever, maybe 2 to 3 pages, and the tutor guide was like, 8, 10 pages extra, more. So it's not insignificant, like, to just kind of toss it off, like, I just want to make that clear.
and I'm going to share why when I get to the tutors. I'm going to come to what I do with the tutors in a second. Thanks, Scott. You're absolutely right. There was a lot with that. Thanks for acknowledging my work. I appreciate that. That was good. That's good. So here's the key when you do the case, and this is a dilemma that I've gone back and forth with on, do you provide the references or not? In the purest form, I would say no. right? Especially where I position this. This is the last 8 weeks before you go off and you're not an independent clinical practice. You've got 32 weeks to supervise clinical, but after that, you're on your own. I would much rather say, no, you don't have references. This is a relatively safe environment. You should start to develop the skills to say, what do I need to know? Where am I going to go? Is a guideline the best place? Do I need primary literature to answer this question? Can I use a textbook? And I always tell the students the answer is always no. Like, no, like it's got to be at least a secondary reference, that type of thing. But I really believe they shouldn't, okay? And so I actually have swung back. I used to give like 3 or 4 selected ones. Now I don't. So for 2 years now, I've removed those references. This McMaster, I was convinced, 'cause I was trying to do everything Mac did. Mac actually gives a bunch of references for their case now. And that, it almost crushes me a bit. Like, oh, that's not. But I think it's because, like, you know, they're doing their whole thing right from the very beginning on. This course for me, because of where it's sequenced, I want them to be at the point where they're working towards being independent practitioners. So I do not give references except for those cases where I say, here's a trial that I want you to critically appraise. And you better be prepared to, having gone through this, to answer all the questions to determine internal and external validity of that study. And as I say, that, so really my thing is where the placement is. For this one, it's at the end. If it was earlier on, maybe I might include a couple references just to give them an idea. Tutor, here's the big key, right? And so this is what I've been talking a lot with Steve and Scott about when they're coming up with this. There are a lot of things. The ones I'm putting in bold are, in my mind, the most important things. Number one is making the environment comfortable. Like, this really should be a fun thing. This should be like when we get together and chat about teaching and stuff, they should have the same thing. They're learning, and it should be really exciting for them. So I want a tutor that doesn't come in with a big ego and fills the room. It should be the opposite. It's like, hey, how are you doing, guys? In fact, when I tutor at the School of Medicine, I actually bake homemade brownies. Right? Of course, that to me is a lot of jokes. Oh, farmers bring the brownies. I wonder what's in these things, right? But it's like, no. So wouldn't you like to know? So I kind of leave it open. So maybe there's stuff in those brownies, but no, I'm kidding. So make it comfortable, though, right? You want people to actually get excited about this. So there's a little bit of planning. This is almost always the first 1 or 2 tutorials, and then the tutors back out because the students do all of the planning. That maybe first 1 or 2. Provide guidance on learning objectives. So again, I want to make sure that when the students come up with it, that they are able to address all of the ones I've outlined, because that's what I'm going to test them on, right? I have to test them on something unique, or sorry, consistent between the groups. So make sure they have guidance, but I don't want the tutor just, you know, getting to the point where it's like, okay, you got 4 to 5. Here, I'm going to read the 5th one for you. Like, it's not that. I want to make sure that the tutors know they should be helping facilitate the learning objectives, not give the learning objectives, in other words. Asking probing questions, right? So again, novice tutors will get to the point where they look at my tutor guide, and if the students don't mention that point about Framingham, instead of using it as like, so no one's talked about cardiovascular risk. How would you estimate this guy's risk? Instead of doing that, which is what I'd prefer, a probing question, they might go, by the way, you know, Dr. Nagge's gotten his thing here. Remember, this guy's had a stroke, so you can't use Framingham, right? So make sure you know that for the test. That's not what I want, right? It's more about getting the students to do that, because the students then are smart, and they know, we always know the tutors there. They got our back. They'll tell us what we're not getting. Okay, so it's really important the tutors are trained properly about what the educational underpinnings, if you will, of this method, so they understand why they're doing that. And then pretty much the last one here is evaluating learning outcomes. Okay, and so I think, is it the next slide? No, I don't. I'm going to come back and show you how that's done. So now come back to what Scott was saying. So first of all, should your tutor be a content expert or not? So in other words, do I need to, when I have a hypertension case, get people who are very comfortable with cardiology? I would say no, to be honest with you, because if you've got the content expert in there, it's so hard for them to be quiet and seeing students struggle with the concept, right? A little bit of cognitive dissonance, and just sit back and let that happen, right? Whereas if they're relatively not a content expert, it's like, oh, good, I'm glad they're wrestling with that because I don't really know the answer either, right? But there's a healthy balance, okay? So the students have to feel like the person who's in there is still going to tell them if they're going right off the rails. So that's why for my course, I've been encouraged sometimes by the School of Pharmacy to, or at the beginning anyway, can't you just take grad students? Just use grad students. It'd be great. You know, and some of them are even pharmacists. The problem is the grad students that we have who are pharmacists typically haven't practiced in clinical environments, so they don't have as much street cred, if you will, right? And the students know that. And so even with a very comprehensive tutor guide, they're not necessarily familiar with the practice that would be required. So what I do for mine is I get practicing pharmacists who practice in a clinical environment, and I don't care if they know anything about any of the topics though. And that's why I provide all the detail in my guides and provide 11 pages, if you will. And the other reason why I provide about 11 pages is, number one, develop a retention strategy. The second thing that takes the most time is to find and keep good tutors. So once I've got one, I want to do everything I can to retain them. And one of the ways I do that is I make sure they never feel uncomfortable in tutorial. Right? Be the person there where the students go, oh, I don't know what the answer is. And they look right at the tutor, and the tutor's like, I don't know. I never want them to feel like that. So that's why I make sure that their tutor guide is so extensively prepared so that even if they don't read any of the required references, I give them all the references as well. Hey, read this, it's great, that type of thing. But I know everyone's busy. Even if they can just read the 5 or 6 page tutor guide that I give them, they're going to be prepared, and they know it'll be up to date. Okay, so that's another reason why I do that. That's excellent. The adequate training. So here are the things I make sure I cover in my tutor training sessions. Okay, make sure we go over PBL theory, probably not to the same extent that I do with you. Well, actually, probably yes, to the same extent that I would do here. What are the attributes of a good tutor, right? So again, comfortable learning environment, understanding, they don't encourage competition, that type of thing. How to ask probing questions, right? So we talk about Socratic method and probing methods. How to provide meaningful feedback for individuals and the students. So we do a lot of mock reflections. So how would this reflection process look? And we'll practice it as a group. One of the best sources for getting PBL tutors, and this is difficult, if you're thinking about starting PBL, keep this in mind, graduated students. So the young lady who's with us this afternoon, she was a student in my PBL course and now is back as a tutor and is one of my best. And it's because she understands the process. She really identified with the PBL learning process, and she's fantastic. So and so I do everything. Justine, I'm like, hey, if I buy her coffees whenever I see whatever, like just get her to keep coming back. That's the key, right? If you have someone who's experienced in PBL, it makes it a lot easier to do that. And I think that's why Mac was really happy to take me as a tutor. That's one other thing I was going to say. Interdisciplinary is great though. Right? I would feel, as long as Oscar gave me a really good study key, or Steve, I'd love to learn from Steve too. So if he gives me a good study key, I'd be happy to go over there and act as a tutor. Because I understand about PBL, and as long as I've got the info, I'd be very comfortable in doing that. So, okay, here's what my course outlined. Another really important thing to think about is how are you going to assess students? So Mac, for example, all of the students' assessment is based on their tutorial performance. That's it. 100% is based on what you do there in the medical school. They have sort of midway tests that are just for reflection purposes to tell the student, are you falling behind or not? But the only thing that counts for marks is how they do in the tutorial. So I've wanted to do that at pharmacy and just make it a pass or fail type thing. And I need more help from people to support that. Like, so Lisa, I'm looking at you because the curriculum committee is like, oh, but don't they have to write a test? No, they shouldn't have to write a test, right? The idea is they should be prepared for tutorial. So I'm still working on that. The test, though, really important to think about. You can't do multiple choice, right? You just can't do multiple choice with PBL because then that gives the students the impression that they have to memorize facts. That's not what this is about, right? It's about finding information, critically appraising it, applying information. It's problem solving. That's not multiple choice. So it's all short answer case-based. That's the third thing that will take up a bit more time. Or if you're, some people would say conniving like me, or I'd say entrepreneurial like me. Make sure right from the very beginning you budget in for a TA, and so I get a TA to do all my grading for me. So thank goodness that doesn't take my time. But that's the way that it should be done. Again, all the PBL curriculum literature would say the exact same thing. As you see, the other 50% is based on their tutorial participation. So this is based on how they perform in the tutorials then, and that's one of the ways that we make sure the students are independently doing all the learning objectives, because if they're only doing 1 or 2, they can't do well on our rubric. And so we were talking about the last time I was in this room. I was here for the CTE, and I'm putting in a plug now, on how to design a rubric for your course. It might not sound like the most exciting one. It was awesome. So this is what our rubric was, okay, years ago, and this was on a triplicate form. So the tutor, there'd be 3 of them. So the tutor would fill these in at the midterm and final evaluation for students, okay? And they'd rip off 1 page, give the student, they'd keep 1, and then they'd have to get it to my office. And of course, I wasn't there because I was golfing, so I'm not in a tutorial. Like, it's just a mess. There's papers flying everywhere. So what we did was I put this in Learn, and it's fantastic because now the tutors can just do it from home, and immediately the students get it and go straight to gradebook, okay? But notice how these are extremely precise definitions of each of them. And I'm going to give you an example. So for quality of contributions, exceptional. Conveys a greater than expected understanding of the material. Contributions were consistently accurate. Okay, so first of all, you didn't say things that had nothing to do with anything. Precise, insightful, and frequently enhance the understanding of other group members. So for the first 3 years of this program, I kept refining this more and more based on tutor feedback and students, because students are like, oh, I think I do fine. Why didn't I get 90 in this course? So we're trying to move them, obviously, to this exceptional range, and we're trying to be extremely explicit in the behaviors that would push you there. Where I get back to how do I get the students to reflect, down at the bottom, contribution to group process and leadership. So consistently listen to others, willing to sacrifice personal interests, provide a consistent, effective leadership, merged as the group leader. This is where, like, if they're not contributing to reflections, that's where they'll get nailed. And there's room for the tutors to write that then is, you know, take the reflections more seriously, please, and you'll improve your mark. This is what it looks like now then on Learn. So it's the exact same text. I'm just showing you that it is possible. And I remember when I came to that rubric session, like, oh, no, we can't create one like that. But we actually did figure out how. So if anyone wants to incorporate anything like that, just let me know. Pretty much everything I've got. These are 2 excellent resources. These resources, I would say, and it would be interesting when Steve and Scott talk a little bit about this, these are more directed towards clinical PBL. So this is from McMaster, and it certainly resonated with me in pharmacy. I think there are really good tips, though, even for other disciplines. I'll let Steve and Scott talk more about like how they found them. And again, if you're interested in some more, I've got some other excellent ones. But those are really good get-started ones. One's written by students in PBL, and then one's written for faculty development. Last 3 slides I've got is just some feedback. So the very first offering that we did this, again, I planned for this the whole time. But here's what they said was, like, students were saying, what's the right answer? That was in my feedback. What's the right answer? Like, there's no context to that at all either. What's the right answer? Like, I knew what they were saying is, I never got an answer in this course. Why do some groups learn different things? So again, you got 15 different groups, right? And some groups, as I mentioned, one group might say, I want to learn about aspirin and hypertension. Well, that's not my learning objective. That was theirs. And that's fine. But of course, one other group is going to say, why did they learn about aspirin and hypertension? Well, it's because they decided to. I don't know. So you'll get some things like that. Give us the learning objectives is the number one thing I'll hear over and over and over again. To say, oh, the only way you can ensure consistency is if we all have them. And I always just say no. Like, I'm sorry, you're not getting them. That's a crucial part of this. And I explain why. Like, I don't just say no. Like, if I had a big beard, I might go, no. But I don't have a beard, so I've got to explain a little bit. But so the solution based on all that, we did nothing. And we examined why some of this feedback was coming. And a lot of it was because this is our vanguard class in pharmacy. So we started off, we didn't have our building ready on time. So I was telling Oscar, we were in the basement of engineering. What's all the engineering? Yeah, so I was supposed to say, what's the least desirable? Yeah. And that's what we got. Engineering's like, well, we're done with this. You guys can have that room because we got a beautiful one over here. So we're stuck down there so the students have the right thing. Every course was brand new. You can imagine not every course went perfectly. You know, so they get to the final year and then they're like, now we're changing it up. And so they weren't as excited as I was about it. So I think it was more the class because what we do is we kept everything the same. And here's what's happening. And this is far more consistent with what we get. I thought this was the best IPFC in terms of student learning. Now that kind of sucks. It's like what you said too. Like, I love to lecture. This is the only one I don't lecture in. Everyone's like, this is the best. Well, that tells me I'm obviously not. So thank you for that. But I guess that's a backhanded comment. PBLs, I'm joking, obviously. It's a good idea. Help me build confidence when providing therapeutic recommendations and be more comfortable about confronting disagreements on therapeutic decisions. That's exactly what we want this, right? Love PBL, great way to learn. Felt or retained information better than from a didactic lecture. And again, that's what the research shows as well. So the final slide I've got, and this is because Scott reminded me I should just say a really quick thing about this. There's only one significant modification that I've made to PBL in pharmacy over the years, and it was this. It was based on an academic integrity issue. So you saw the tutor guides, right? Tutor guides, the instructor objectives are given, and also the quote-unquote answer key. Unfortunately, I guess one of those got out to the students. And the only way that could happen was a leak through one of my tutors. Unfortunately, and I think I know who it was, and so this individual hasn't been invited back. So essentially what we did, and it was picked up because I actually did have to fill in the one day, and I was listening to one student talk, and I was like, wow, that's a great answer. That sounds exactly like what I would say. And then after the third time I noticed that, I'm like, that is exactly what I would say. And I look at the answer key, I'm like, it was verbatim. I was like, holy crow. So sure enough, I confiscated the students' notes, brought them up to my office. It was, and of course, it was like an FBI investigation. The associate dean assigned, two associate deans came in. They telephone interviewed 18 people. They found this underground network of people handing USB keys in the pharmacy library at 11 o'clock at night and all this type of stuff. So anyway, here's the key. Be very careful and protective of those guides because they have a lot of work involved in them. I will say medicine has used the exact same cases every year since I've been there for about 10 years now. Because my director said, why don't you create new cases? I'm like, really? guys, you gotta give me 4 months off to do that. But so that's the first thing is just rotate it. Well, yeah, have some to rotate maybe, but you can't create them all. It's too much work. So it's just you have to be very protective of it. And the way we dealt with this, and this is the only significant modification, is as of 2 years ago, I said there's no electronics allowed in tutorial. Okay, and so you can imagine what happens. So the students are so used to, and again, this is like U of W. It's like, oh my God, we have to have a computer everywhere. No, I said no computers because you can bring any hard copy reference in, but the rationale is that if it's detected, and I tell this to the students, I'm like, if it's detected that there's a lot of similarity between what you're saying, what's in the guide that the tutor has, they have the right to confiscate all of the things on your person, as opposed to like having to steal, like take a laptop. So the students are aware that I know about this. And I tell them, if you get any notes handed down from you, honestly, it's in your best interest. 4th year, do you want to be expelled from pharmacy in 4th year? Probably not. So don't even look at anything that's given to you and focus on this. What's happened, I thought there'd be massive revolt. It's the opposite. The tutors say that the quality of discussion is so much better. People aren't behind their computer. They aren't jumping on Google to, oh, I forgot to look that up. Let's all look. It's gone. So they have a richer discussion because it's just on their notes. And that's how I learned as a student. And that's how we were doing it at Mac. Mac now allows laptops. So that's the only thing to consider when you're designing it too. What electronic things would you want? Because sometimes it just distracts from the actual learning if they're constantly searching as opposed to discussing. So I went like way over, so I apologize. Any quick questions for me now before we, is it a break that we're going to take?
I think we're going to take a break.
Okay.